Hello, and welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Creative Confidence Podcast, where we talk to subject matter experts about creativity, leadership, innovation, and growth. I'm Co Stafford, an executive design director at IDOU. For those of you joining, we always use the last portion of our webcast to answer your questions. So start thinking about that and drop them in the chat. As you're joining, please share where you're calling in from. I'm excited for our conversation today. We'll be talking with a longtime friend of IDEO and prior guest, Bob Sutton. And Bob, I saw you already put your intro in the chat. Welcome, Bob.
Welcome. It's great to be here.
Yep.
And I
And
and
as
I
you,
just I just love all the different places from all over the world. South Africa, New Zealand, all over the United States. It's just wonderful. Berlin.
it
So
is
welcome everyone.
indeed, indeed. We're in for a treat. So today we're going to be talking with Bob about the topic of friction. And in particular, he has a new book coming out next week, January 30th. So we're going to get a preview. We're going to discuss common ways that friction shows up in organizations, when it can be destructive, and when friction can actually be reframed as a good thing. There's things we can do as leaders to use friction to make things easier for both your team and your organization. All of this in the context of a new book that's coming out called The Friction Project. And we'll say more about that in just a moment. Bob, I need to gush about you for a moment, and then I promise you we'll get into the content. So let me give a proper bio about Bob Sutton. So Robert Sutton is an organizational psychologist and New York Times best author. You've published over 200 articles and 8 books, including your most recent one, The Friction Project. He's a professor at Stanford, teaching on topics around management science and behavioral sciences, and you've helped found a variety of programs and institutes, such as the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. Your work has received a lot of praise. One of my favorites is it's been described by Fast Company as the smartest and most original take on leadership and organizational creativity that I've read. Did you know that
Oh,
one, Bob?
oh yeah. Well, that was my friend Polly LeBear. It was about a book I wrote, which was inspired heavily by hanging out at IDEO, called Weird Ideas That Work. And that's my worst selling book. But I think it's my favorite. So
Well,
yeah.
well, you've
So
got
yeah,
another one coming out next week, so I guess we'll
right.
see how this one stacks up,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about friction, and I want to engage the audience, which I know you love to do too,
I
Bob.
love
So,
that.
so I'd love a question for all of you joining live today. I have a warm-up question. What kinds of friction do you encounter in your role or your organization, especially any that drive you crazy? Drop your answers in the chat. And Bob, I have the same question for you. What
Oh.
what friction drives you
Oh,
crazy?
well, obviously the list is long because we wrote a whole book, but I would say that if I was going to pick one thing that drives me crazy, it's at my employer, it's getting expense reimbursements. It's such an ordeal
Oh,
that honestly, I do this personal calculation, which is I just bought, I don't know, like a ream of paper for $18.99. And how much of my time is it worth in frustration? Would I pay $18.99 not to fill out the experience and have it bounce back 7 times? So that's the one that I would pick if I was going to pick just that little thing that drives me crazy. Uh,
you've got people agreeing in all caps. The chat went so fast with so many comments, I can't keep up. So it's everything from tactical things like you mentioned. I'm seeing, approvals, but then some big meta themes too. Resistance to change,
yes.
no flexibility, like conflict around ideals, hostility and lack of team engagement. What are some of the ones you're seeing, Bob, that stand out to
Oh,
you?
well, providing feedback. Uh, I, I don't know what butts and Sears is. Seats.
Oh, butts and seats. Yes.
So
Back in
this
office. Back in office.
back.
Yep.
Oh yeah, yeah, back in
Hmm.
the office. So we're just getting this is like the Rorschach test.
Hmm.
Lack of trust. So you've just got everything sort of in the way, tracking hours around creative processes. So this is one thing that we were talking a little bit in the sort of preamble, is that in a lot of, I know the audience does creative work, that you've got sort of the people who, the micromanagers, are so concerned with what you're doing absolutely every minute that they actually drive out the creativity of the process. That's often a big problem. So
And
yeah,
you
we
bring that up. What's good though, too, is like what we're going to talk about, it's friction. but not all friction is bad. So
No.
we're going to talk about how it's not about trying to eliminate that friction, but well, let's go there.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
talk about your book. Let's go there.
All right.
So your newest book is called The Friction Project, and specifically how smart leaders make the right things easier and the wrong things harder. So let's start there. Quick overview. What is the big idea of this book?
What
And what's something to know about this friction project? I understand you've been working on it for about 7 years.
Yeah, it's not. It's really more like 8, even though we're claiming 7. But
Okay.
where it started, and I love the chat because the chat, in some ways, for me, is like I'm having flashbacks
Mm,
because where Huggy Rao and I, my co-author, we got interested in the idea of friction, essentially that feeling that things are harder to do than they ought to be,
mm,
was just every organization, especially as they got larger, older, and more complex. We work with Google, Facebook, Salesforce, just sort of named like the Silicon Valley giants. We worked with them in our own university,
yeah.
Stanford. That there was all this frustration, and honestly, this whole and I'm seeing some positive friction things in here now too. This whole list was the kind of things that would drive us crazy. So people would say I work in a frustration factory, that I feel
Oh.
like I'm so deep in shit that I can't show any initiative at all, any will. And so we would get a lot of that. But then, luckily we don't have real jobs, so we would start doing case studies. I did a podcast for a couple of years on friction. Maybe I'll do it again. And just worked with a lot of companies and did a lot of little experiments. And the good news was, well, first we found out that it actually was possible to fight back. It's not like
Mm,
we're helpless. And I think that the book is we can
mm,
talk about that as packed with solutions. And the other part, which we're seeing here, is that there are some things that should be hard and slow and difficult. And when people, and this is one of the problems, when people want to make things too efficient in life, sometimes it drives out creativity and innovation. And we were talking some before that Ed Catmull, my hero, Ed Catmull, best business book ever written. Look how many Creativity Incorporated. He's just amazing. When I wrote, Ed, about how do you make creativity more efficient during the 32 years that you led Pixar, he said we never talked about efficiency. We just talked about doing it over and over and over again until we thought it was right. And that is not something that makes a bean counter happy, but they sure made plenty of money, with their movies. So there are times when friction should be good, and
slow down. Yeah. Slow.
just because something should be hard.
Got it. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about this book is I took time to acknowledge. So when I encounter friction, what's my response to it? We all feel it in our body in some way. And so it's interesting to think about. So when you encounter friction, like what's your natural response to it? And I admit mine is I tense up, I get frustrated, I feel stuck.
Right,
And one of the things you care deeply about why you did this work is you want to give people ways forward and to not try to like only it's misguided to think the role is to eliminate friction. It's to get curious about friction, and there's good types and there's bad types.
right.
So can you say a little bit more about that? What does that mean? Good friction
Well,
and bad
well, well,
friction.
well, well, so what's good or bad friction? Well, I would start with the high level. Is a lot
Okay.
of it depends on the nature of the craft that you're
Yeah.
engaged in, and slowing
Ah,
things way down when it's an emergency. That's friction and frustrate people and
yeah.
having people fail. I don't know, when the patient is like on the verge of dying because the blood's spurting or the airplane's about to crash. This is not a time to sort of slow down and pull over and have a meeting. But there's a whole bunch of times in life when we've just sort of got to just slow down and figure out what the heck is going on, even though people want to race forward. And it's everything from the great line from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, is when you're in a situation in a cognitive minefield where things are messed up, people are confused, often the best solution is don't just do something, stand there. So you make everybody slow down and yourself,
Mm,
and you figure out what the heck is going on before rushing off in the wrong direction. So that to us would be an example of just sort of slowing down. And in terms of the way that organizations work, some of the best teams that I've worked with have the sense when things are messed up, let's just hit the brakes, and let's spend a day, an hour, a week figuring out what's wrong with us and what's wrong with our product. We use the
Yeah.
example of Waze in the book that did this quite effectively earlier in their career. And maybe the analogy, and we just had a Wall Street Journal piece come out literally just a few hours ago that people can look at that talks about this. One analogy we like is it's like race car drivers.
Okay.
The ones who get around the track the fastest are the
Yeah.
ones who know when to brake and know when to take a pit stop.
Yeah.
So it isn't pedal to the metal all the time.
It's knowing how to shift and adapt and be
Yeah.
mindful of and intentional. I've heard you talk about it in that way. It's well, let's talk about the friction fixer. So if the one of the goals of this book is to help people at any level of the organization be what is known as a friction fixer. So
Yes.
you can take agency to help to help remove obstacles for where there is, to spot and remove obstacles, to slow down. But also you even talk about make the wrong things harder to do. So tell me a little bit more about a friction fixer and what that means or how we can all start to think about
What
that in
what
our roles.
well the way that we think about it is that all of us, whether you're the CEO of a large concern or you're a frontline supervisor
Yep.
or maybe a frontline McDonald's employee, that we all have kind of a cone of friction. We have the ability to make things harder or easier for people.
Mm.
And just at Stanford, there are certain people, since I noticed all the emotion about how hard it was to get, our expenses reimbursed. There are certain people at Stanford, we call them gunk people, who I would never go to. I would pay so much money to avoid having an interaction with them because and then there's other people. Well, actually, I'll use her name. Her name was Kim. She was the money person at the Stanford Design School. And she always used to say, the rules are tough, but it's my job to say yes to you. Now, that's she was a Greece
Mm.
person. So,
Mm.
so we all have this sort of cone of friction. And yes, CEOs can do stuff. One thing that we like to harp on, and we start the book out, is with executives who send too frequent and too long emails. That's a cone of friction for an executive. They can actually slow down thousands of people by doing that. But my favorite example, and I noticed that your folks are from many different countries,
Mhm.
but in many different countries. In fact, I was just talking to somebody from England just yesterday, that you have something like the equivalent of the Department of Motor Vehicles, a place you got to go to register your vehicle, to transfer it, to take your driving test, and all this sort of stuff. For those of us who live in California, the Department of Motor Vehicles is an infamously terrible experience. If you want to go there, and I just dread going there, but, and this is in the book, when I went there, I had a great experience because there was this guy. I was in line. There's 60 people in front of me at 7:30 in the morning, and he was a frontline supervisor. And within his cone of friction, he took it upon himself to walk up and down the line with a set of forms and ask each of us why we're there, give us the form to fill out, maybe tell some people that, no, you can't do that, so you're wasting your time here. Or here, you can just fill out this form. You don't even have to wait in line after that. And at 8 o'clock, the doors open, and I was out of there at 8:15 because he'd been a trustee of
Mm.
all of ours time.
Mm.
And within his cone of friction, he had made everything better. And now Huggy, this isn't in the book, but Huggy and I are starting a case study with the people who run the Department of Motor Vehicles, and they see themselves as trustees of the time of the 20 million or so people are in California. And I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who works with Google, and Google is having serious friction problems,
Mm.
bad friction problems. And so I was joking to her. I said, you ought to do a case study of the Department of Motor Vehicles and apply it to Google. I bet you could make yourselves better, because the DMV is doing a great job. So, so,
That's a great story.
so yeah, but the CEO and this guy on the front line in Redwood City, they all see themselves as trustees of our time as citizens of the state of California.
And that's I know you embedded it in the story there, but that is one of the big ideas of your work is a friction fixer, you are a keeper of others'
Yeah,
time.
yes.
And if you slow down and just really internalize that, like I think of my job and I think I want to, I try to do good work. I try to be
Uh,
effective work. I don't know if I've ever thought about, my responsibility is to be a keeper of others' time. Boy, that frames things differently when you approach it like that.
Yeah, and a lot of times, especially people who are in senior leadership positions,
Yeah.
we have a chapter on oblivious leaders that it's almost like they have a different perspective. I hate to bash senior leaders, but it's almost like their definition of structure and organization is so, excuse my language, but is so that it's set up for as much ass kissing as possible. And this is one of my concerns for a lot of executives I know. The reason that they seem to want people to return to work, which is could be incredibly inconvenient, and actually there is the evidence that people are more productive when they're working at home rather than the office is actually pretty good. There are other good things that happen in the office, but the one thing that's pretty clear to me is that the fawning, the flattering, it works much better in 3 dimensions in person than on Zoom. It just doesn't feel as good on Zoom as it does in person. And I really think that's one of the sick motivations that some, especially narcissistic leaders I know have. And if they thought of themselves as trustees of other time, they might structure the work differently for the folks where they work. And I'm not like a Nazi about nobody should ever go into the office, but I think some of the motivations and calculations are wrong.
Well, let's dig into some of these themes in your book, as you're starting to mention. So in your book, you discuss a number of common ways that friction shows up. We've been talking about some. We've actually covered a lot of great ones.
Yes,
I want to focus. And it's so good.
The
I love
chat's
people.
so good.
People love your honesty, Bob. So let's just keep going there. For the conversation, I want to focus on 2 of them that I think are great for kicking off the new year. We're in a new year. It's that time of year when it's kind of good to just be reflective and mindful of how we're working and how we want things to go. And so one of my favorite ones you talk about in the book is called a friction you call addition sickness. And so let's just dive in here a little bit. What is this? How does it show up in organizations?
Well, addition sickness is essentially the tendency for organizations and people to solve problems, especially when they're kind of mindless mode of just adding.
Yep. Let's do more. Let's plan more.
Let's add. And there's 2 kind of forces that cause us to do it. One, and I'll plug my friend's book. Leidy Klotz wrote this great book called Subtract. And
we'll put that link into. Yep.
I like the coffee stain on the front. So anyways, so Leidy and a bunch of his buddies from University of Virginia, this is a Nature magazine article. They did about 20 studies where they gave people a whole bunch of different chores, everything from planning a vacation, revising a recipe, fixing a university, improving a Lego model. And the standard solution that we human beings do to almost any problem is we default to addition, to making it more complex. So that's
like, give the Lego example. The Lego example is brilliant. I love that one. It's so tangible. Say that one.
The Lego example was the best way to improve this little Lego model was to remove 2 or 3 pieces, and they were actually charged for adding more pieces. And still, the default solution people would use would be to add 4 or 5 pieces. And that would happen over and over again. So that's the sort of human, the way we're wired. And then there's organizational life. At least in every organization that we've worked with, and 2, this is really clear right now, Google and my own university, Stanford, but throughout the world, essentially, when you as a manager have more people reporting to you, you have a larger fiefdom, you get paid more. So there's an incentive. And then when you add leaders, well, they add, especially administrators, they add things for other people to do, more rules, more regulations. And then you end up with all those people in finance who make it impossible for us to get reimbursed in some of our organizations. And then in people who add more programs in this flavor of the month problem, which I'm sure almost everybody in the audience has experienced, where they keep adding one sort of new initiative after another. I remember I went to an insurance company in Wisconsin. I remember this guy was interviewing, and he said, well, so I just got trained in design thinking, digital transformation, and agile, and I'm on task forces for all 3. And I'm so busy being trained and going to task force meetings, I don't actually have time to do my job. And to me, that's just an example of just more and more addition. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there is a lot of things that we found that smart organizations do to resist it in the first place and to engage in subtraction. So it's not like it's all over and every company's terrible and we're just screwed. There are things that many organizations do. But that's the addition sickness problem.
Yep. So again, let's do a tangible example of what people can practice or try out in their space right now. I did get some people just want to. I'm just going to back up to and just kind of realign where we are. So we're talking with
Uh,
Bob Sutton around friction, and the
uh,
big idea is friction is the forces at work that make things harder, slower, complicated. And Bob mentioned this idea of the cone of friction is really,
right.
could I reframe it as it's like your sphere of influence, regardless of
Yes.
where you sit in an org, it's the mindsets and the behaviors that you can influence. So let's go there, Bob, around this idea of addition sickness. So do you have an activity you share a bunch in the book? What's something that
Well, let's do two
do
real
to
quick.
yeah.
Okay. So one is just so Huggy and I have done this 200 groups. I think I even
Okay.
did it at IDEA once. And we call it the subtraction game. And I
Okay.
just to give you the range, I've done it with the top 8 members of the management team at Bloom Energy, and I've done it with four like I think about 2,000 beer distributors for InBev in an
Okay.
auditorium. So you go to the person
It can go
next
to
to
any
you,
scale, is what I'm
any
hearing.
scale, and
Okay.
you first of all you identify what's driving you crazy in your workplace,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
you pick something, classic sort of design thinking or brainstorming thing. You pick something that's feasible to subtract, and you pick something crazy, and
Like
then
when
and then
like what? Like what do you mean?
well,
What's an
something
example?
crazy would be let's abolish human resources. That would be something that I've
The whole
heard before.
department. Okay. Yeah.
The whole department,
Okay.
or or things like let's to get rid of problems with pay differences. Let's pay everybody in the company the exact same. That would simplify things enormously. Um, and let's fire the CEO. I've also had that said to a CEO as a joke, but wasn't really a joke. So that's also another form of subtraction. Um,
And
so,
this is good because where is this going?
well, no, that's the fun part.
Okay.
Those are the wild ideas. The ones that tend to be more feasible are let's get. I'll give you a really specific
Yeah.
example. So this was I was doing something with a bunch of EVPs from a large software company,
Okay.
and
Yep.
on the call, there's 28 of them, not a lot
Yep.
of them. So this guy's got about 800 people reporting to him, and has a weekly top management team meeting, senior team
Okay.
meeting. He said,
Yep.
"Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to change it," and he changed it live to every 2 weeks.
Yep.
I think that's pretty good. Um, Another example, when I was doing this subtraction game, this was with another large software company. This was 400 EVPs. They did a poll, and the thing that drove them the most crazy was how many Slack messages they sent to one
Mhm.
another, and the length, the irrelevance, and so forth. And there was sort of like a collective pledge by all of them to reduce the number of Slack messages they sent in the next week by 25%. I thought that was pretty good.
Ah, that is good.
So,
And it's tangible, it's tactile,
so yeah,
it's
yeah. So, and then my favorite
mhm.
one of my favorite ones. So this was in a pharmaceutical company, and so this is like the top 60 or 70 people, and the chief, what do you call it? The general counsel, the head lawyer, he raises his hand and he said, he's looking and he said, "So I think we've got 87 parental leave policies, 87." He said,
87.
he wrote me an email 2 weeks later, he'd gotten rid of 20 of them. I think that's pretty
That's
good.
great. Yeah. We even have like in the chat, people just sharing one example. We just been create a monthly report and send it to 100 plus leaders. We don't even know if anyone's reading it. Like, and so that's why hearing this is take time to acknowledge what are the things that are creating complication and friction in your team, in your org, and your and play the subtraction game. What would
Well,
it look like for us to take away versus try to contain or modify or create something to make it better? Just what would it look like to just take away, remove, reduce, edit?
And
Yeah.
so the subtraction game is fun to talk about. We also have another set of
Uh-huh.
tools that Rebecca Hines and I and some other folks at Asana developed, where we have this is in HBR and it's in the book. And it's essentially you have people list all of their standing meetings and assess them for the
Yeah.
value and how much difficult they are. And when we did it at Asana, and people evaluated their meetings. It's about 25% of their meetings were high effort and low value. And then Rebecca, in particular, who I worked with, who's head of the Asana Work Innovation Lab, she worked with them to remove meetings, to make them shorter, to reduce the number of size. And it looks like we saved the average Asana employee in this sample about 4 hours a month. So that tool is also there. One thing as we have this conversation where I worry about both of these tools is that a lot of times there's high friction versus low friction. To get rid of really serious friction is a very, very high friction activity. And the example, which is my favorite example of friction fixing in probably the entire 8 years that we did this, in the state of Michigan in the United States, there's a government benefits form. 2.5 million people a year complete it. It's if you need to get food for your kid, health insurance, money, and so forth. 2.5 million people complete it. It used to be 2015 or so, 1,000 questions long, 42 pages. One question was, when was your child conceived? Okay. So, and everybody knew it was a terrible form. And there's this guy named Michael Brennan who actually worked some with the Stanford D School as part of this. And he actually hired some folks from the Stanford D School and started something called Sevilla. And he and his team spent a couple of years grinding out, going through the bureaucracy, getting support from the top, developing 6 prototypes, coming up with a solution that complied with the 1,700 pages of rules, regulations, and laws. And now in the state, and then rolling it out to thousands of employees. And now in the state of Michigan, when you need those benefits, there's a new form. It's 80% shorter. And to me, that's something that's 2.5 million
significant at an org level, at a government level, at a policy level. It's so impactful.
It's so impactful. But the point about that is that they really had to do some, and this is in the Wall Street Journal article, which some of you can't access because they charge you for it. And we talked to Michael Brennan for the article there too, and he just talked about it was really important to slow way down to fix it right. So sometimes removing friction is a high friction activity. I
love that you said that. Let's build on. Let's go there for a moment too, and then we're gonna switch to questions from our audience.
Oh, we love that.
So you've talked a couple times about the importance of slowing down and how that's actually creates friction, but it's constructive friction.
Yes.
So another portion of your book, you talk about this theme of this problem area of fast and frenzied teams. You even have Anna asks, what about this whole go quick and break things? And so, Bob, one thing I know I really admire about your work is you're very much an organizational designer. You think about designing at the org level, and you can't control for every interaction, every moment. You can't design every system, but you can target specific moments to be more impactful. And as a friction fixer, as someone, and so especially this idea of if things are moving too fast, it's killing creativity, it's burning people out. You talk about like pausing to start things right is one key moment where you can have a lot of impact. And I call it the bookend, taking time to end things right. So can you tell us a little bit more about why those can be good moments to slow down and introduce constructive friction?
Well, let's start out with the beginning, because so one of my mentors, the late J. Richard Hackman, probably the most important and prestigious groups researcher who's ever lived. Amy Edmondson's mentor, if you know the famous Amy Edmondson of psychological safety fame. So Richard's research, he studied basically one thing for 80% of his 50-year career, which is what makes teams more or less effective. That was his lifelong quest. Few other side trips, but that was mostly it. And Richard always argued that the beginning was so important because that's where you do the initial design of the system and also pausing to redesign the system when things are messed up. But let's just start with the beginning. So initially figuring out who's in different roles, what are the kind of norms, how are we going to spend our resources, what are our goals, what is excellence to us, that the teams that started and got that right. Sometimes they call this a team charter, that yes, in part of the norms are almost always we have to keep going back and reconsidering what we've done, as opposed to assuming we started in the right place. But even if you're wrong, and people used to say, well, what if you got that wrong? And Richard would always say, because he was this big giant guy who was one of my mentors, who used to run around smoking his pipe and running around rooms like with no shoes on, smashing into chairs with his socks. He was quite a character. He would say, at least you've got a foil. You know what's wrong. You just don't have a bunch of disagreement about who we are or who we are not. And to me, that's the logic of prototyping. The advantage of having a
Yeah.
prototype is that you have something tangible to riff off of, to tweak, or
And
to throw
adapt.
away even completely. So to him, it's starting with like a complete set of agreement about who we are and who we are not. And IDEO's founder, David Kelly, and we talk about David in the book, that's one of David's sort of genius, is he always started, whether it's a product or with an organizational design with a strong point of view. And I remember him even saying about a design change at IDEO, it's just like our products. If it doesn't work, we can
Prototype.
change it. But beginnings are extremely important, especially look at Hackman's lifetime of research on what makes a team effective.
And I know you mentioned like setting logistics, but you also talked about agreements, because it's not just like how we're going to do the work, but how it's going to feel is what I heard
Yes.
in that as well. And so we like feelings.
Yeah, yeah,
Feelings.
me too.
Yes, I know, right? So let's talk about endpoints too, like taking time to end things right. Why is that important, and how does that, yeah,
So in terms of, well, first of all, one of the reasons to take times to end things right is that if you don't do it, people don't believe that it's ended. So whether
and
it's
then
a
the
rela
friction continues because they're
yeah,
like, are we still doing
right,
this?
whether it's a
Okay.
relationship, whether it's a project, whether it's an organization. So I did my dissertation on organizational death, and one of my
What was it? Oh, organizational
death,
debt.
death,
Death, not
death,
debt. Death.
DETA,
Oh,
like the process of closing a plant, or the geography
okay.
department, the
Okay.
Department of Michigan. And one of the advantages of having like a funeral for a dying organization is it's just like a
And then
person,
it
you believe
just,
they're gone.
mm,
But in general, endings are very important. And I mentioned Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner. He's
mhm,
done all this research that reveals what's called the peak end rule, which is that, and this is for all of the designers out there, many of you probably already know this, when you look back on an experience, and you think about, was that a good experience or a bad experience? There are two parts that matter the most. One
mm,
is the peak, the
mm,
best and the worst, and then the way it
mhm,
ends. So
mm.
having good endings are really important.
Yeah.
And just one of the little examples
Mhm,
in the book, we've gotten really into this idea of sort of savoring, is that, at the end of the day, at the end of a project, rather than making a to-do list about what we're going to do next, and the end of a day is another sort of ending for all of us, the end of a
mhm.
week, is that we steal an idea from someone else, and we say maybe we should make a to-do list instead of a to-do list. And that's where you as an individual
Oh,
or your team together sort of pauses and said, what happened this week that felt great, that I want to kind of wallow in a little bit, as opposed to, I mean, we can always talk about what sucked, because there's always some things that
yeah.
suck. But even in some of the worst experiences, I mean, there's things that are good, this is really bizarre to say, but two of the most heartwarming and wonderful things I've ever been to are both of my parents' funerals. Because
Mm.
it's pretty weird, but I mean, there was just laughing and joking and caring, and
It's,
it allowed us to sort of savor in their lives a little bit.
mhm.
And I mean, that's an extreme case, but I saw that with organizational funerals too. That
I
that
love
that it
that.
was an opportunity to remember the best about the
Mhm.
organization, the geography department of Michigan, which I went to the funeral for it. But ends are really important, and just for customer satisfaction,
Mhm.
it's really important that the final thing that happens, touch point for the customer, is really important. It's sort of like your last
It is.
opportunity to make them
Yep.
feel good. So
We
there's that as the design principle too.
totally, I mean, in a lot of like our service design work, we talk about designing for the moments that matter. And again, it's kind of in the peak end rule.
Yeah.
There's moments that matter throughout a process, but an endpoint is one of the most impactful ones. It's like dessert. It's the one that
Yeah,
resonates.
yeah.
That, yeah, I just love dessert. So, I had to throw that in there.
Oh, desserts are important.
They are. It determines the whole meal for me personally. But I really, and I there's great energy in that. Like Bob, I appreciate how you're transforming this into acknowledging the friction, but also the positive things that can come from it too. So the to do and the to da example is wonderful. It's one that we could all practice this week in our context. So I think we're going to move to some questions.
Oh, great. I'm excited. Let's go.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're going to go back to the bad friction for a moment. And
Sure.
we have a question from Alex, and it's, how do you inspire change, especially with someone who is introducing a lot of bad friction in a context?
Ooh. So I'm going to go full design thinking on this one,
All right.
which is to the extent. So let's take somebody who's got a little or a lot of power, who is either sustaining or creating a system where they're introducing friction and they don't even realize it. To the extent that you can have them experience that same crappy experience rather than protecting it from them, it can help. And
Hmm.
just two quick examples from the book. One is, you will recall, I talked, and I love this example of Sevilla, where they reduced this form by 80%. And what they did, the folks who ran Sevilla, there was an agency in Michigan that was responsible for overseeing it. And what the folks in Sevilla did, to their credit, is that the top 8 people agreed to go to visit the Sevilla offices. And the first thing the Sevilla folks did was they gave them the 1,000-word form, or 1,000-question form,
Mm-hmm.
42 pages, and they had the top 8 people try to fill out the form. Only one of them had ever filled it out before. The guy's name, I think, is Terry Baer, who was head of the agency. He raised his hand after page 8 and said, "I can't get any further." This is the guy who's overseeing the form. That, to me, and to his credit and his team's credit, they didn't get defensive. They didn't blame people. They said, yes, there's a lot of resistance and problems at fixing this. Let's work together to figure out a way to fix it. And they did fix it within 2 years. So
Wow.
that's a big one. And then one of my favorite ones for is at least as a professor, I'm always annoyed when my students are late. I'll admit it. And so I remember, this is about 15 years ago. I was in Chicago. I
Yeah.
was part of a MacArthur panel, and we had a bunch of high school principals talking about the challenges of running their schools. And
Mm-hmm.
there was this woman, she was a principal of a New York City school, and she said, I've learned to shadow my students about once a week because I learned so much about the problems. And she said, I was always mad at students who were tardy. And then she said, and then I followed this girl. This girl, it's a 7-story building. This girl has her class in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Her teacher, there's 5 minutes to go between classes. Her teacher keeps her 2 minutes late. And the girl starts running up the stairs, but it's that time of month she needs to change her tampon. So she goes in the bathroom, she
Right.
changes her tampon.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, some things you got to do. And then she gets to her class on the 7th floor, and she's 4 minutes late, and the
Yeah.
teacher yells at her.
Yeah.
so so to me, that's a great example of a principal who is really quite upset that, oh, these lazy students, they're like smoking cigarettes, they're gossiping, that's why they're late. It was partly a design system. So what she did was she worked on 2 things. One, she changed it for 8 minutes instead of 5 minutes between classes. And then she cracked down, and she actually had the students report when teachers would keep them late because it made it so
Yeah.
hard to
Because
go.
that was beyond their control.
It
That's
was
a great
also
one. Yeah.
reversing the power of blaming the teachers rather than blaming the students. So there's a little
Yeah.
power reversal. But I mean, there's lots and lots of solutions into something that we all can work on together. But that's kind of the place that I start,
Yeah.
is let the people with power suffer and wallow in the muck with you.
And just you say suffer wallow. We could also call it empathy.
Empathy,
Create
yeah.
conditions for empathy to
Well,
shift perspectives. Yes.
it does create empathy, but
Yes.
maybe it's, I was raised by a Jewish mother. I always think a little strategic suffering is always very useful. So anyway,
So this is wonderful, Bob. I have time for one more. And
okay,
this came up early on. So this is the idea of let's see, people not willing to use new tools, or the processes are too slow, or there's a lack of a system. And this came up when we were asking people what frustrates you. And there was a lot of themes of like, we just don't do it that way, or we're resistant to change. So this comes from the question is, sometimes processes are too slow,
right.
or people are not willing to use new tools or systems. How can we lessen the friction in these situations?
Ooh, well, so So it is. So literally this moment, I'm working with the aforementioned Rebecca Hines from Asana,
Mhm.
and we're trying to dig into the notion of resistance to change. And yes, there are many times when human beings don't rationally adopt or learn new tools that they should learn. But I've learned to be a little bit careful, and I learned this from Jim March, one of my late
Okay.
mentors, organizational theorists, that people in leadership and also expertise positions, when there's resistance to change, you should take that as information because
Right. It's an indicator there's something interesting there if you get
yeah,
curious.
yeah,
Sorry.
and or that you're wrong. And I'll give you
Oh, right.
I'll give you a great example. So this is a paper that was led by my colleague Melissa Valentine
Hmm.
at Stanford, and it was, I won't name the company, but some of us will be able to guess. It was an online clothing retailer.
Okay.
And first, so we're talking about AI. First, they came up with an AI solution for the clothing buyers. We're talking about the people who design algorithms, and said, "Here's our AI solution." And they made it as efficient as possible. And they said, "This is brilliant. It's going to work." So they gave it to the people who actually ordered the clothing, and they rejected and found it useless.
Mm.
And they got really mad at the AI people. But then the AI people said, "Gee, what if we slowed down and did an iterative process where we brought in the clothing buyers and us, and we worked together and iterated a system?" And together, so it's with the experts and the, if you will, the AI nerds, they iterated a system that they built together. And you think about that, and again, this is slowing down to win. It was really quick
So,
for them to sort of throw it over the wall and give them a system, but in this took months and months to do. But the second system actually worked, and they did get fired. It made their jobs easier because they co-created it together, where you had, the people who knew the technology and the coding and how to design an algorithm, and then you had the experts who knew what sort of help that they needed. And sometimes they were surprised the algorithm could help them in ways they hadn't imagined. So to me, that's a case where first there was resistance to change that was rational, and then they slowed down to work together. And yes, that overcame resistance to change, but it also resulted in a much better design for everybody.
yeah, yeah, I love that. And just it's a theme we talk about too. And in any design, people support what they create, which goes against subtraction. Like there's still
Right.
subtraction, that's important too. But it is important the being a part of the process with your customers. Everything gets better when you're connected to the customers and doing processes with your customers, period.
Yep.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Bob, we are out of time. This has been
Oh, it's so fun.
magnificent.
The
Uh,
chat, please send, the chat is just
yeah,
remarkable. Thanks everybody
this
for all your comments.
and
Amazing
I
questions. Amazing.
amazing. And it's what I love too is I can tell so many of us listening today are excited to bring these into our practices and try things. And I feel renewed inspiration to some of the challenges we feel. So I do have one last question for you, Bob. I get the last question, and it's and then I'll wrap us up. And I always close with what advice would you have given to yourself in a earlier stage of your career? So
Ah,
a younger Bob Sutton. So you get to think on that. So while Bob thinks on that, we thank you everyone for joining us. We've been hearing from Bob Sutton, organizational psychologist and New York Times bestselling author. Bob's book, The Friction Project: How Smart Leaders Make the Right Things Easier and the Wrong Things Harder, is coming out in just a week. It launches on January 30th. You can find it at your preferred bookseller, or you can learn more at his website, bobsutton.net. And you've gotten a wonderful preview of a lot of the themes today. And so I encourage you to check it out and bring it into your practice. If you want to dive deeper into some of your learnings, I encourage you to check out some things in our IDOU ecosystem. There's one I'm really excited about. So we are launching a new course called Creative Thinking for Complex Problem Solving. A lot of the same topics, Bob, of
ooh,
just how you enter
ooh.
complex problems, how you address friction, how you use creativity and play to unlock things. So that course launches in March, and it's designed again to equip you with tools, mindsets you need to approach complex problems with different ways of thinking, new perspectives, twists, all those things. So you can learn more about that at idou.com/creative thinking. And with that, Bob, final words to you. What advice would you have for
Oh
your
gosh,
younger self?
so I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm sort of like moving to emeritus status at Stanford and looking back on my life and
Uh-huh.
everything. And I got kind of obsessed with this academic literature on savoring. So
Mm,
there's all this research on coping. So there's the bad things in your life, the hassles, the stresses, the things that annoy you,
yeah.
the nasty people in your life. So how do you sort of reduce the damage they do to you?
Okay.
There's all that stuff, cognitive behavioral therapy. Your audience will know that. But the savoring stuff,
Hmm.
uh, I don't think it gets enough attention, and it's something I think about my life. It's that there's all these things in life that are wonderful, like the things you see in nature, the wonderful, we were talking about food before, the wonderful meals that you have, just having like really nice experiences. So just to sort of slow down and enjoy them.
Mm.
And the other part about the savoring literature, which I've been reading some of the stuff, is that people who savor, like, they anticipate how lovely
Mm.
things are going to be, and then they take a few minutes to, they sort of a little bit like the tada thing, like to talk about how wonderful that was. And they don't sort of like rush from like one good
Oh,
thing
I
to
love
another.
that.
So if I and like I, if people who know me will tell you I'm not exactly a world-class saver. Like I kind of like rush through one thing after another, and I kind of am trying to bring myself to slow down and to enjoy
Oh,
the good things in life and think about them while they're happening, as opposed to being distracted and thinking about the next thing that's annoying me or something like that.
that is beautiful. Do you have that link or that tip? How could
Oh
we?
yeah, well there was recently a Hidden Brain episode on savoring, and there's a book on savoring. I'm trying to remember the name of there's a guy who's devoted his whole, academics who's devoted his whole life to studying savoring. So this is if you just put in savoring, you'll find it.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bob. It's been a pleasure to have you. And thank you everyone for joining us today on the Creative Confidence Podcast. Enjoy your day, enjoy your week. Bye.
Bye. Okay, I gotta go to the other link.